In the second week of April 1979, men arrived at the record rooms of 2 hospitals in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk and took the files away. They took the admission books. They took the clinical histories. They took the public health department's outbreak reports and the death certificates that had already been written and the ones that had not been written yet. 15 years later, when a team of American and Russian scientists published the first full account of what had happened in that city, they put the fact into a single flat sentence in the journal Science. The hospital and public health records of the epidemic had been confiscated by the State Security Service. By then, 66 people were in the ground. Their families had been told that the cause was meat. One person did not comply. In the pathology department of one of those hospitals, a woman named Faina Abramova had already opened the chests of the dead and seen what was inside them. When the order came to surrender everything, she carried the glass specimen jars into the teaching museum along the corridor and set them on the open shelves among the ordinary ones, where nothing is hidden and nobody looks. The paperwork went into filing cabinets marked for other subjects entirely. Then she went back to work. The question that took 13 years to answer was not who was responsible. Soviet citizens in that district had a private opinion about that within a month, and American intelligence analysts had a written one within a year. The question was simpler and much harder. It was what could still be proved after the proof had been collected and carried out of the building. This is the record of how that was answered. A working suburb on the southern edge of a closed city, a diagnosis that the local pathologists made correctly in the first week and were not permitted to state, a treaty the Soviet Union had signed 7 years earlier, which made the truth not merely embarrassing, but legally impossible to admit. A cover story so medically specific that it convinced a Harvard professor for 6 years and was delivered in person in the United States by a deputy minister of health. And in the summer of 1992, 5 people with a cemetery map, a list the Security Service had written itself, and a set of weather records archived 4,000 miles away in Colorado. Along the way, it will be necessary to say what the evidence does not reach. The hour of the release is still disputed. The number of people killed is not exactly known and cannot now be established. No government has ever set out, on the record, what took place inside that production building. Those gaps are not failures of research. They are the intended product of the decision this film is about, and they are still working. If you want more films built this way, from the documents up, subscribe. The scientific paper that finally settled it runs to 7 pages, and its central finding is a compass bearing, 330 degrees, give or take 10. To understand how a number like that came to matter more than any confession, you have to start 20 years earlier, with a district that was built downwind of something nobody was allowed to name. They called it Chkalovsky. In the spring of 1979, the Chkalovsky district of Sverdlovsk was a working suburb, and its largest northern neighbor had no name. Sverdlovsk itself was a serious city. It sat about 1,400 kilometers east of Moscow, at the point where the Ural Mountains flatten out and European Russia becomes Siberia, and it had been built up during the Second World War, when whole factories were dismantled in the West and moved east ahead of the German advance. That history left it heavy with industry and heavy with secrets. Foreigners were not permitted to visit. On the maps that ordinary Soviet citizens could buy, several of the things inside it did not appear at all. Chkalovsky was the southern district, a grid of low apartment blocks and workshops and rail sidings, with something like 10,000 people living in it. It had a pipe plant. It had a ceramics factory with 2,180 employees on its books. It had schools, a stadium, allotments where people grew potatoes, and the particular quiet of a place where most adults leave for the same 3 or 4 buildings every morning. On its northern edge there was a compound. It covered about 200 hectares, and it was surrounded by a fence and a checkpoint, and the people who lived nearby referred to it by its number, 19. Inside the fence, there was a residential zone with something like 7,000 inhabitants, a 75-bed military hospital, schools, shops, a stadium of its own, and parks. Families lived there. Children went to school there. It was, in the ordinary sense, a neighborhood. It was also, in the part behind the second checkpoint, a biological weapons facility. The institution had opened in 1949 as the Scientific Research Institute of Hygiene, which is the kind of name that is chosen to be forgettable. In 1951, it began work on botulinum toxin. In the 1970s, its main effort shifted to Bacillus anthracis, the organism that causes anthrax, and in 1974, it was renamed again to the Scientific Research Institute of Bacterial Vaccine Preparations. The renaming did not change the work. Behind the inner fence, there were underground laboratories and production units, and in one of the production buildings, there was a spray dryer, which is the machine that takes a liquid culture and turns it into a dry powder of the correct particle size to be inhaled. None of this was written down anywhere a resident of Chkalovsky could read it. What the residents knew was that the compound existed, that soldiers lived there, and that you did not ask. There was one more thing about that facility, and it is the single fact that determines everything the Soviet state did after the 2nd of April. It was not supposed to exist. On the 10th of April, 1972, the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Bacteriological and Toxin Weapons was opened for signature. The Soviet Union signed it. More than that, the Soviet Union became one of its 3 depositary governments, alongside the United States and the United Kingdom, which means Moscow was not merely a party to the treaty, but one of its official custodians. The convention entered into force on the 26th of March, 1975. Its first article is short. Each state party undertakes never to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire or retain microbial or other biological agents of types and in quantities that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. An institute drying anthrax to respirable particle size has no prophylactic justification. There is no protective purpose served by a powder engineered to be inhaled. What the Soviet Union did after 1972 was not reduce the program, it reorganized it. Through the 1970s, a network of institutes was assembled under a body that presented itself as a civilian pharmaceutical and vaccine enterprise, and that network became the concealed structure through which the offensive work continued and expanded. Kanatchan Alibekov, who rose to a senior position inside it before defecting, described a program that at its height held anthrax stocks measured in hundreds of tons. So the building on the northern edge of Chkalovsky was not simply a secret. It was a treaty violation, being committed by one of the treaty's own guarantors, on a scale that would have been the largest arms control scandal of the century if it had been established. Set that beside a plume of spores drifting over a suburb of 10,000 people on a Monday afternoon, and the shape of the next 13 years becomes something other than cowardice or embarrassment. An admission was not available. There was no version of the truth that could be told partially. To say that people in Sverdlovsk had died of inhalational anthrax released from a military facility was to say, in the same breath, that the Soviet Union had been running a prohibited weapons program since signing the prohibition, and had been doing so as the treaty's custodian. The lie was not chosen over the truth. The lie was the only remaining move in a position that had been lost 7 years earlier, in a signing ceremony. This is worth sitting with, because it explains almost everything that followed. The relationship between the district and the facility was not one of ignorance, it was one of trained incuriosity. People understood that there was a category of question that produced no answer and some risk, and they had adjusted. When something went wrong, that adjustment was already in place, and it did most of the work of the cover-up before any official had to lift a finger. The wind in Sverdlovsk, in early April, is not usually from the north. That is a small meteorological fact, and it will eventually carry the entire case. So it is worth stating plainly now, in the ordinary way it would have appeared in a weather log. At that season, the prevailing air over the southern Urals comes around from the west and the southwest. Northerly wind, blowing from the compound down across the district and out into the countryside beyond it, is uncommon. In the days that followed, the 2nd of April, 1979, the meteorologists at Sverdlovsk Airport recorded wind from that northerly sector in fewer than 2 out of every 100 observations. On the 2nd of April itself, they recorded it all day. From 4 in the morning until 7 in the evening, the wind came steadily out of the sector, between 320 and 350 degrees, at 4 to 6 meters per second. That is a light breeze. It is the kind of wind that moves washing on a line and does not otherwise announce itself. It came off the compound and it went south-southeast, across the ceramics factory, across the pipe plant, across the apartment blocks, across the allotments, and on out of the city into the villages beyond. Monday, the 2nd of April, 1979, was a working day. Anna Komina was 54 years old, and she worked at the ceramics factory, where her job included checking the temperature and the acidity of the water in the tanks. It was outdoor and semi-outdoor work, the kind that takes a person across a factory yard several times in a shift. Vera Kozlova was 48 and also worked at the ceramics plant. Mikhail Markov was 46. Fagim Dyanov worked at the same factory, which stood about 3 kilometers south-southeast of Compound 19, and who he was and what happened to him will take a chapter of its own to say properly. What all of them had in common on the 2nd of April was geography and a shift pattern. They were adults, they were outdoors, or moving between buildings, or standing at an open door, in a strip of the district that on that particular day lay directly beneath a plume of air coming off the northern fence. Inside the fence, according to the account given years later by Kanatchin Alibekov, who was then a rising figure in the Soviet biological weapons program and who defected to the United States in 1992, a filter had been taken out of an exhaust line and had not been put back. The next shift started the machinery. Alibekov's estimate of how long it ran before somebody noticed is not precise, and he did not pretend it was. Minutes, he said, or perhaps an hour, or an hour and a half. No more than that. That account is a memoir. It comes from a participant in the program, recorded long after the fact, and it should be held at that weight rather than treated as a technical report. The Soviet military never published a technical account of what happened in that building, and the Russian Federation has not published one since. What is not in dispute, because it can be measured from the outside, is the direction the air went and what it carried. The quantity involved was very small. When the physical evidence was finally reconstructed in the 1990s, The estimate for how much material escaped came out at less than 1 gram. Possibly, the estimate ran, as little as a few milligrams. A gram is the weight of a paperclip. It is worth holding that number next to the 2,180 people on the ceramics factory payroll, because the arithmetic of what happened next is not the arithmetic of an explosion. Nothing detonated, nothing burned. No siren sounded in Chkalovsky on the 2nd of April, and no announcement was made. And by every measure available to a person living in those apartment blocks, it was an unremarkable Monday that ended in the ordinary way. Anthrax delivered into the lungs does not announce itself either. There is an incubation period, and at these very low doses, it can run long and it can run uneven. Some people in that district were carrying the organism for 2 days. Others were carrying it without symptoms for 6 weeks. That unevenness would later be one of the things the official explanation could not account for, and one of the things that made the official explanation necessary in the first place. An outbreak with a single sharp onset looks like an event. An outbreak that dribbles out across 42 days looks like a food supply. For the first 48 hours, nothing happened at all. There is a version of this story in which that silence is sinister, and it is not. The best evidence indicates that the release was an accident of the most ordinary industrial kind, a maintenance step missed at a shift change, in a facility where the consequence of missing it happened to be different from a factory that makes ball bearings. The men inside Compound 19, who understood what had escaped, had, at that point, done nothing worse than fail to say so. What they did next is the part that had to be covered up. And what they did next began on Wednesday. The first illnesses in Sverdlovsk were recorded on Wednesday, the 4th of April, 1979. They did not look like anything in particular. A person felt faint. There was dizziness, a shortness of breath, a low fever, a cough, aching in the chest and across the shoulders. In a Soviet industrial district in early spring at the end of a long winter, in a workforce that smoked heavily and worked in cold buildings, this is what a great many things look like. Some of the people who felt it that Wednesday went to a clinic. Others finished the shift. Anna Komina, who checked the water at the ceramics factory, became ill on that Wednesday. Vera Kozlova became ill on that Wednesday. Neither of them had any reason to connect what they were feeling to anything but the season. Then, in a proportion of cases, the illness did something that ordinary respiratory infections do not do. It improved. This is the feature of inhalational anthrax that has made it so lethal historically and so easy to misread clinically. The first phase is unremarkable, and it lasts a few days. Then there is a lull, and the patient feels better, and sometimes goes back to work. And then the second phase arrives, and it arrives fast. Breathing becomes difficult, and then impossible. Blood pressure falls. In the Sverdlovsk cases, the average interval between the first symptom and death was 3 days. Anna Komina collapsed on the 8th of April. She died 2 days after that. The hospitals in the district began receiving patients they could not explain. Hospital 40 took the most severe of them. The doctors there were competent physicians working without the one piece of information that would have made the picture instantly legible, which was that a military facility 2 or 3 kilometers upwind had released an aerosol of weaponized anthrax spores on the previous Monday. Deprived of that, they were looking at a cluster of working-age adults arriving in respiratory collapse, and they were looking at it without warning. Margarita Ilyenko was the director of one of the receiving hospitals. What she described afterwards was a fortnight in which the institution she ran stopped functioning as a hospital and started functioning as something closer to a front-line dressing station. Patients arrived faster than they could be assessed. The mortality was extraordinary. The morgue filled and then overflowed, and bodies were held outside it, and the staff who had to move them did not know what they were handling or whether it could be caught from a corpse. She organized the district response herself. She recruited volunteers to go house to house through the affected streets, to find people who were sick and had not come in, and to carry out disinfection. It is worth noticing what that means. In the first 2 weeks of this event, before any commission arrived from Moscow, the practical public health response in Chkalovsky was being run by a hospital director and a group of neighbors, working from a description of symptoms and a map of streets. The clinicians did what clinicians do when a patient is dying and the diagnosis is unclear. They treated what they could see. Antibiotics were given, and antibiotics are effective against Bacillus anthracis if they reach the patient early enough, and in 11 cases they did. 11 people in Chkalovsky who contracted this disease in the spring of 1979 survived it, and they survived it because doctors working without the crucial piece of information nonetheless reached for the right drug. Those 11 survivors matter to this story, out of all proportion to their number. 13 years later, 9 of them would sit down and answer questions about where they had been on the 2nd of April. The volunteer survey that Margarita Ilyenko organized deserves the same recognition. Sending neighbors house to house through a district to find undiagnosed cases is, whether or not anyone involved would have used the word epidemiology. It is active case finding. It is the correct response to an outbreak of unknown source, and it was being improvised by a hospital director and a group of local people because the institution that knew the source had chosen not to tell them what they were looking for. Within days, the pathology department had the answer. Faina Abramova was the pathologist who made the initial identification, and she made it the way such things are made, by putting tissue under a microscope and seeing the organism in it. Bacillus anthracis is not a subtle thing to look at. It is a large rod-shaped bacterium, and in tissue from a fatal case it is abundant. She saw it, and she knew what she was seeing, and the diagnosis of anthrax was therefore established in Sverdlovsk, within roughly a week of the first death, by a local doctor, using a microscope. That fact matters more than almost anything else in this film, and it matters because of what happened to it. The truth about the cause of death in Sverdlovsk was never lost. It was never mysterious. It was established early, correctly, by the people whose job it was to establish it, and then it was taken away from them. By the middle of April, there was a second finding, and this one was decisive in a way the first was not. Anthrax reaches a person by one of 3 routes, and the routes leave different marks. It can enter through a break in the skin, which produces a characteristic black ulcer, and is rarely fatal if treated. It can be swallowed in contaminated food, which produces an infection of the intestinal tract. Or it can be inhaled, in which case the spores are carried into the deep lung, taken up, and delivered to the lymph nodes in the center of the chest, where the infection establishes itself and destroys the tissue of the mediastinum, the compartment between the lungs that holds the heart and the great vessels. The route can be read at autopsy. It is not a matter of interpretation. Intestinal anthrax leaves its damage in the gut. Inhalational anthrax leaves a chest full of blood. Lev Grinberg worked with Abramova and performed most of the autopsies. Between them, the 2 pathologists documented 42 cases in detail. In case after case, the finding was the same, and it was the finding that only comes from breathing the organism in, hemorrhage from the lymph nodes of the chest, hemorrhage from the mediastinum. The widow of one of the men, Tamara Markova, would later repeat to a Western journalist the sentence a doctor had given her when she asked what had happened to her husband Mikhail. His lungs, the doctor said, looked like jellied meat. That is as far as this film will go into the physical detail, because the detail is not the point, and repeating it does not honor anyone. What matters is the evidentiary status of it. 42 documented autopsies, all showing the thoracic pattern, constitute a proof of route. Not a suggestion of route, a proof. And there is a second proof sitting alongside it, which requires no microscope at all, and which anyone could have checked. There were no children among the dead. In an outbreak caused by contaminated meat sold through a district's shops and markets, children die. Families die together. Households are the unit of exposure, because households eat the same food. When the graves in Sverdlovsk were eventually counted and the victims identified, the pattern was the exact opposite of that. The dead were adults, overwhelmingly of working age. They were not related to one another. There were no family groups. There was no child anywhere in the list. What they had in common was not a butcher. It was a Monday and a compass bearing, and the fact of having been out of doors. By the third week of April, then, the situation in Sverdlovsk was as follows. The cause of death was known and correctly diagnosed. The route of infection was documented in dozens of autopsies. The demographic pattern excluded a food source on its face. All of this existed on paper, in 2 hospitals, in 1 district of 1 city. And that is the point at which Moscow arrived. Within days of the first deaths, Moscow sent a commission to Sverdlovsk with authority over the city. It was called an Extraordinary Commission, which was the standing Soviet instrument for a situation that had exceeded local competence, and it was controlled from the capital. 2 ministers came to the city in person. Dmitry Ustinov was the Minister of Defense and a member of the Politburo, one of the 4 or 5 most powerful men in the Soviet Union. Boris Petrovsky was the Minister of Health. American analysts noted the visit afterwards, because the presence of a defense minister at a food poisoning outbreak is the kind of detail that does not require interpretation. The Commission's first substantive act was to take the case away from the people who had solved it. Civilian physicians were barred from treating the victims. Military medical personnel took over the care of the seriously ill. The hospital and public health records were collected, and the diagnosis that Abramova had established under a microscope and that Grinberg was documenting on the autopsy table was not overturned. It was, in a way that is much more difficult to argue with, kept and reassigned. It is worth being clear about what an extraordinary commission was, because the name sounds improvised and the instrument was not. In Soviet administrative practice, it was the standing mechanism for an emergency that had outgrown the local apparatus. A commission was constituted, it was given authority over the civil institutions of the affected area, and it reported upward rather than sideways. Once one was seated in Sverdlovsk, the city's own health authorities were no longer deciding anything. They were being instructed. The takeover of clinical care by military medical personnel had a second effect, beyond controlling the message, and it is the effect that shows up 13 years later in the interview record. It put a barrier between the dying and their families. Relatives who would ordinarily have been at a bedside were outside a ward, receiving information from officers rather than from the doctors who had admitted their husband or their mother. What families could later report about the final days of the people they lost is therefore thinner than it should be, and that thinness is itself a consequence of a decision made in April. This is the hinge of the entire cover-up, and it is worth being precise about it, because it is not the thing most people assume happened. The Soviet government did not deny that there had been anthrax in Sverdlovsk. Denying that was never possible. Too many people had died, in too small an area, with too distinctive a pathology, in front of too many doctors. What the government did instead was accept the organism and change the doorway. Yes, the official position ran, this was anthrax. It came from meat. Consider what that accomplishes. It concedes the finding that could not be hidden, which purchases enormous credibility. It moves the causation from a military facility to the agricultural sector, which is a category of Soviet failure that could be admitted without consequence, and in fact, was admitted routinely. It provides a mechanism for a long, uneven wave of cases, since a contaminated meat supply distributes over weeks. And it places the blame in a location where an outsider cannot check, because a foreign scientist cannot go and inspect a collective farm in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, and a Soviet citizen who tried would be asked why. It was, on its own terms, an excellent lie. It survived 13 years. The reason it survived was not that it was aggressive, it was that it was modest. Notice also who it did not blame. It did not blame a foreign power. It did not blame saboteurs. It blamed a farm, a slaughterhouse, and some men selling meat out of the back of a vehicle. That is an accusation with no political charge in it at all, and it therefore invites no counter-accusation and generates no diplomatic incident. The story asks nothing of anyone. It simply closes. A cover story that closes is worth more than a cover story that fights. And it had one further advantage, which is the hardest of all to work around. It could not be disproved from outside the country. Every element of it sat behind a border. The farms were in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. The slaughterhouse records were Soviet records. The market traders were Soviet citizens. The patients were in Soviet hospitals, and the bodies were in a Soviet cemetery, and the tissue was in a Soviet pathology department. A foreign scientist could disbelieve the account. He could not test it. For 13 years those were different things, and the whole structure rested on keeping them different. The practical work of installing it began immediately. Death certificates were an obvious problem, because a death certificate is a legal document that says what killed a person, and there were a great many of them being written in Chkalovsky in April of 1979. What the surviving evidence indicates is that the certification of these deaths was brought under central control along with everything else, and that the cause recorded was made consistent with the meat account rather than with the autopsies. The pathology, meanwhile, said the opposite, in 42 separate documented cases, and it said so in a form that no administrative instruction can revise. A hemorrhagic mediastinum is not an opinion held by a doctor. It is a condition of a body. That is why the records had to be physically removed. There is a further consequence of that, and it explains why this event has no confession in it anywhere. A cover story built on reassignment rather than denial does not require many people to lie. The doctors in Chkalovsky were not asked to say that anthrax had not occurred, because it had. They were asked to accept a statement about its root, issued by a national commission carrying 2 ministers, in a system where a physician who disputed a Ministry of Health finding was not disputing a fact, but challenging an institution. Most of them simply stopped being asked their opinion. That is how an operation of this size runs without a leak for 12 years. It does not need conspirators. It needs a chain of people who each did something small and defensible. The people who came for them were doing something rational. If the account is that these people ate bad meat, then the single most dangerous object in the city is a stack of autopsy protocols describing chests full of blood, because that stack refutes the account by itself, permanently, To anyone with medical training who ever reads it, you cannot argue with it, you can only take it. And so, in the second week of April, while patients were still arriving at Hospital 40, and while Margarita Ilyenko's volunteers were still walking the streets knocking on doors, the record rooms were emptied. Faina Abramova's response has been described a great many times since, and it is usually described as an act of courage, which it certainly was. It is worth also describing it as an act of professional judgment, because that is what makes it work. She did not hide the specimens somewhere clever. A clever hiding place is a place that will be searched, eventually, by someone who has thought about where a person would hide something. What she did was recognize that a hospital pathology department already contains, as a matter of routine, a room full of preserved human tissue in glass jars, kept for teaching, sitting on open shelves, labeled in the ordinary way. That room is not a hiding place, it is furniture. She carried the jars from the Sverdlovsk victims into that museum and set them among the others. The documentation went into filing cabinets that were devoted to unrelated subjects. Nothing was buried, nothing was smuggled out of the building, nothing was disguised. The material stayed exactly where a pathologist would keep pathology, in a room whose entire function was that its contents were unremarkable. Grinberg kept working alongside her. Between them, the description of 42 cases was completed and preserved, which means that the single most important evidentiary document produced in Sverdlovsk in 1979 was finished after the confiscation by the two people the confiscation was aimed at. Nobody outside that department knew for 13 years that any of it still existed. The two pathologists went back to their careers. Abramova continued as a working pathologist in a Soviet regional hospital, which is a job of long hours and modest pay, and she did not tell anyone what was on the shelf. Grinberg did the same. There was no plan for the material. There was no assumption that a foreign scientific team would ever arrive, because in 1979, no such thing was imaginable. The jars were kept for the same reason that most true things are kept by the people who know them, which is that destroying them would have been a lie told with one's own hands. Outside the pathology department, the district was about to be washed. By the third week of April, the Chkalovsky district had become the object of the largest public health operation the city had ever run. The scale of it is the clearest surviving evidence of what the authorities privately believed, and it is worth going through in order, because each measure implies a specific fear. Antibiotics were distributed to affected households. Tetracycline, in quantity, to people who were not ill, which is prophylaxis rather than treatment, and which means the expectation was further cases. Sick rooms were disinfected. Bedding and clothing were collected from the homes of the sick and taken away. Fever screening was set up across the district, with referrals into the polyclinics, so that a person running a temperature would be found rather than waited for. On the 22nd of April, buildings were hosed down with chlorine solution, and a mass vaccination campaign was run through the district using the Soviet anthrax vaccine, which was manufactured at the Scientific Research Institute of Vaccines and Sera in Tbilisi, in Georgia. Something in the order of 59,000 people were eligible in the Chkalovsky district. Roughly 80% of them were vaccinated. 59,000 people, against a disease the state was simultaneously describing as an isolated problem with a meat supply. That is the contradiction at the center of the containment effort, and nobody in the district failed to notice it. Residents were being told, on the one hand, that the danger was a few contaminated carcasses that had entered the market illegally, and instructed, on the other hand, to be inoculated, to surrender their bedsheets, to accept antibiotics they did not need, and to watch their buildings be sprayed with chlorine. People understood that the two messages did not fit. What they did not have was any means of doing anything about it, and any reason to believe that saying so out loud would improve their situation. There were other measures, of the kind that get remembered by residents long after the official account has faded. Streets were washed down. Stray dogs were killed, because dogs scavenge, and a scavenging animal in a contaminated zone is a vector. Trees in the affected strip were dealt with. Roofs were cleaned, and the cleaning of roofs is the detail that matters most in this chapter, for reasons that will be clear in a few minutes. Trees in the affected strip were cut back or taken down. Topsoil was disturbed and replaced in some places. These are not the measures of an administration worried about a butcher's shop. They are the measures of an administration that knows a specific corridor of ground, received a specific deposit on a specific afternoon, and that the deposit is still there. Anthrax spores are extremely durable. That is the property that made the organism attractive to a weapons program in the first place. A spore is a dormant, armored form of the bacterium, and it can persist in soil and in dust for years, and in some conditions for decades. A light dusting of spores that settled out of a plume on the 2nd of April did not decay by the end of the month. It sat on the surfaces where it had landed, in the gutters, in the dust of a factory roof, in the dirt of an allotment, and it waited. Which means the containment campaign was not paranoia. It was, if anything, an accurate reading of the physical situation, executed by people who had been told to describe it as something else. The vaccine itself is worth a sentence because of where it came from. The Soviet anthrax vaccine of that period was a live spore preparation manufactured at the Scientific Research Institute of Vaccines and Sera in Tbilisi, in the Georgian Republic, some 3,000 kilometers from Sverdlovsk. Getting enough of it to the Urals to inoculate the greater part of a city district at short notice in April is not a local decision, and it is not a small logistical undertaking. It required central authorization and central transport, which means that at the same time as the Ministry of Health was preparing an account about illegally traded meat, the Soviet state was moving vaccine across a continent to protect 59,000 people in one suburb of one city. Both of those actions were taken by the same government in the same weeks. Only one of them was described to the public. There is a defensible reading of the containment campaign that should be put on the record, because this film is not in the business of assuming the worst where the evidence permits better. The measures taken in Chkalovsky in April of 1979 were, considered purely as public health, largely correct. Prophylactic antibiotics, active case finding, decontamination of surfaces, and mass vaccination are what a competent authority does when a population has been exposed to an aerosolized spore. People in that district are alive today because those things were done. The indictment is not that the state failed to protect them. It is that the state protected them while lying to them about what it was protecting them from, and that the lie had a specific cost which arrives in the next chapter, on a factory roof. The burials were handled separately, and they were handled by the state. Victims were interred in a designated section of a cemetery on the eastern edge of the city, in graves that the authorities controlled. Anna Komina was buried that way. Her husband was not permitted to be present. He is recorded as having died afterwards of grief, which is not a medical finding and is not offered here as one, but it is what the people who knew him said, and it is the kind of thing that belongs in the account of a public health emergency because it is one of the costs of it. The families were given the meat explanation. In many cases, they were given very little else. There were households in Chkalovsky in the summer of 1979 where a middle-aged person had gone to work, felt unwell, improved, worsened, and died in the space of about a week, and the account offered to the surviving spouse was that they had bought the wrong sausage. And here is the thing about the vaccination campaign that will matter enormously 13 years later, although nobody involved could possibly have known it at the time. To vaccinate 59,000 people in a specific district, an administration has to write down who they are. It has to know which streets, which blocks, which apartments, which workplaces. It has to produce rosters, and to bury 66 people in a controlled section of a cemetery, an administration has to record which grave holds which person, because that is what cemeteries are. A state that is concealing an event still has to administer it. Concealment does not remove the paperwork. It only decides who is allowed to see it. The security service took the medical records because the medical records described a cause of death. It did not take the grave markers because grave markers do not describe a cause of death. It did not take the addresses because addresses are not a diagnosis. It never occurred to anyone that a list of names and street numbers, compiled for an entirely bureaucratic purpose, was the skeleton of a scientific proof. That is the shape of what survived. Not a smoking document, an administrative residue. It is worth naming the asymmetry directly. The state gave the district everything except the one thing that cost nothing. It gave them antibiotics. It gave them a vaccine shipped 3,000 kilometers. It gave them chlorine and street washing and a house-to-house search and the removal of their bedding. It did not give them a sentence. Stay indoors when the wind is from the north. Do not sweep the roof. That is what the information would have been worth, and it was the only item on the list that would have required admitting where the danger came from. By early May, the district had been vaccinated, disinfected, hosed, and told that the outbreak was over. It was not over. By the first week of May, the Chkalovsky district had been washed, vaccinated, and told that the danger had passed. Faina Abramova worked at the ceramics factory, 3 kilometers south-southeast of the compound on the northern edge of the district. He had been at work through the whole of April. He had been in the strip of ground where almost everyone who died had been standing on the 2nd of the month, and he had come through it, week after week, entirely well. When the vaccination teams came through, he refused. There is no record of why, and it would be dishonest to invent one. People refuse vaccines for a long list of ordinary reasons, and there is nothing in the surviving account that says which of them applied to him. What can be said is that he had been given no true information about what he was being protected from, that the official explanation he had been offered concerned meat he had not eaten, and that by early May, the state's own messaging was that the emergency was finished. A man in that position, declining an injection, is not behaving strangely. On the 3rd of May, as part of the continuing decontamination of the factory, Faina Abramova was told to go up and clean the roof. This is the part of the story that no official account has ever explained. The roof of a building 3 kilometers directly downwind of the release point, in a district that had been dusted with a durable spore on a windy Monday 5 weeks earlier, is one of the most contaminated surfaces available. That is precisely why it was on the cleaning list. Somebody in the chain of command understood well enough that roofs held material to order the roofs cleaned, and the man sent up to do it had not been vaccinated, was not wearing protective equipment adequate to the actual hazard, because the actual hazard had not been stated, and had no idea what he was sweeping. He fell ill the following day, the 4th of May. He was admitted to hospital on the 6th. His case also disproves the account he was never told. A man who had eaten no suspect meat, who worked in a ceramics factory rather than a slaughterhouse, and who fell ill the day after being sent to sweep a roof, is not a gastrointestinal anthrax case. He is a second exposure, from resuspended material, at a known location, on a known date, with a known instruction behind it. There is no version of the meat story that accommodates him. Rema Deyanova was not allowed into the ward. The seriously ill were behind a glass partition by then, under military medical control, and the family stood on the other side of it. She could see him, she could not reach him, and she could not hear him, and so they did the only thing available to two people separated by a sheet of glass in a hospital corridor. They wrote notes and held them up. That went on for 4 days. Think about what those notes had to contain. Not medical questions, because neither of them had been told anything. Not plans, because there were none to make. Two people who had lived together for years, reduced to whatever fits on a piece of paper, held up against a window, in a corridor, under supervision, in a hospital where the staff had been replaced by soldiers. Like she could see him getting worse. That is the part that has no language. She was 6 feet away, and she watched it happen through glass for 4 days, and she was told nothing true the entire time. On the evening of the 10th of May, Fagim Dayanov wrote a note to his wife and held it against the glass. It said, "Rima, do not go home. We may never look into each other's eyes again." He died that night. She was not told immediately, and when she went to find him, he had not been covered. What she walked into was the aftermath of a post-mortem examination that nobody had asked her permission for, and nobody had warned her about. That is as much as this account will say about the state of her husband's body, because saying more would serve nothing except the appetite it would be feeding. The relevant fact is not what she saw. The relevant fact is that a woman who had been told for 5 weeks that the city had a problem with its meat supply found her husband in a hospital corridor in a condition that could only mean he had been part of an investigation she had never been informed of. The autopsy that so shocked her was almost certainly one of the 42. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is arithmetic. 42 of the 66 dead were examined by Abramova and Grinberg, and Fagim Dayanov died in the middle of the series. In the district, those examinations were drawn from, in a hospital under the same pathology department. That is the ordinary, unbearable arithmetic of this whole event. The examinations that were performed on the dead of Sverdlovsk were performed without the consent or the knowledge of the families, in a fog of official untruth, in circumstances that were degrading to everyone involved. Those same examinations produced the only surviving physical proof of what killed them. Faina Abramova's jars are the reason anyone can now say, with certainty, that Fagim Dayanov did not die of contaminated meat. They exist because his widow was lied to. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other. The state's contribution to the Dayanov household afterwards was the same explanation everyone else received. There was no acknowledgement that he had been sent onto a contaminated roof. There was no acknowledgement that a roof could be contaminated, since the official cause was a food supply. There was no compensation. The order that put him up there was a line in a cleaning schedule, and the cleaning schedule was part of a containment operation that officially did not exist, addressing a hazard that officially had a different source. He was in his 40s. He worked in a ceramics factory. He refused a vaccine he had not been given a reason for, and he was killed by a work instruction. His death is also, for the purposes of the evidence, a small and terrible experiment that nobody designed. Consider what it demonstrates. On the 3rd of May, a month after the release, the surfaces of a building 3 kilometers downwind still carried enough viable material to kill a healthy adult man who disturbed them. That is a measurement. It tells you about the persistence of the spore. about the density of the original deposition at that distance, and about the fact that the contamination was on horizontal surfaces, where fallout settles, rather than distributed the way a foodborne agent would be. It also tells you what the people running the decontamination understood. Roofs were on the cleaning list because somebody had worked out that roofs held material. That knowledge is inconsistent with meat. Nobody cleans a roof because of a butcher. So the containment operation was proceeding on an accurate model of the hazard, in silence, while the public account described a different hazard entirely, and the gap between the two was closed by sending an unvaccinated man up a ladder without telling him what he was sweeping. The last onsets in Sverdlovsk came within days of his death. The final fatal case began on the 15th of May, 6 weeks after the wind. By then, the vaccination campaign had reached most of the district. The antibiotics had been distributed, the surfaces had been washed, and the plume had spent itself. The measures had worked. What they had worked on was never explained to a single person they saved. The outbreak in Sverdlovsk lasted about 6 weeks, and the arithmetic of those 6 weeks became, years later, one of the sharpest instruments in the case. The first fatal onsets were on the 4th of April. The last of the fatal onsets was on the 15th of May. That is a span of 42 days, and the average interval between a person's first symptom and their death was 3 days. Then it stopped. The Soviet government's eventual public accounting of the event, when it produced one, reported 96 cases of human anthrax, with onsets running from the 4th of April to the 18th of May. It attributed 64 deaths to the gastrointestinal form of the disease. It attributed none to inhalation. The team that reconstructed the outbreak in the 1990s documented 77 patients. 66 of them died. 11 survived, saved by antibiotics. And there was a third number, which came from an unexpected direction, and which is in some ways the most telling of the three. The security service had itself compiled an administrative list of the dead. That list held 68 names, 3 tallies, from 3 institutions, none of them agreeing, and no way to reconcile them, because the documents that would settle the question had been carried out of 2 hospitals in April of 1979. That is what a confiscation does to a historical record. It does not create a mystery about what happened. It creates a permanent uncertainty about how much of it happened, and that uncertainty cannot be repaired later by anyone, however honest, however well-funded, however sorry. The exact number of people killed in the Chkalovsky district in the spring of 1979 is not knowable and will not become knowable. It is somewhere around 66, and the reason the sentence has to contain the words around and somewhere is a decision made by an official in April. The animals died too. Sheep and cattle were lost in 6 villages to the south and southeast of the city. Rudny, Bolshoye Sedelnikovo, Maloye Sedelnikovo, Pervomisky, Kashino, Abramovo. The furthest of them, Abramovo, lies about 50 kilometers south-southeast of the compound. The Soviet account had a use for those animals. In the official version, they were not victims of the same event as the people. They were the cause of it. The story was that anthrax had appeared in the livestock of the region in late March, that infected animals had been slaughtered, and that meat from those animals had reached the population through illegal private sale. Hold that claim in mind, because it contains a date, and a date can be checked. The official story required the animal outbreak to have begun in late March, before the human cases. Everything depends on that sequence. If the animals sickened first, they can be the source. If they sickened afterwards, they are fellow casualties, and the entire structure collapses. The verification of that date took 13 years, and it is one of the quiet high points of the whole investigation. It will come in its proper place. There is a temptation, looking at 3 conflicting tallies, to assume that one of them is the honest one and the others are propaganda. The situation is worse than that, and more interesting. The Soviet public figure of 96 cases is probably not a lie about the number. It is very likely close to the real total of people who fell ill, and it may even be more complete than the 66 the Western team could document, because the Soviet health system had access to patients the investigators could never trace. What is false in that figure is not the count. It is the clinical attribution attached to it, the assignment of 64 deaths to the intestinal route. That is how a competent falsification actually works. You do not invent numbers, because invented numbers are fragile, and someone eventually checks them. You report real numbers, and you mislabel what they are numbers of. The Security Service's list of 68 sits in a third category again. It was never intended for publication. It was an internal administrative document, compiled for the state's own purposes. And internal documents of that kind are usually the most accurate things a secretive institution produces, precisely because nobody is being persuaded by them. Outside the Soviet Union, the first sign of any of this appeared in January of 1980 in a Russian-language émigré magazine called Posev, published in Frankfurt. The report was thin and second-hand, of the kind that circulated constantly among émigré publications, and was correct, perhaps a third of the time. It said that there had been a serious accident at a military installation in Sverdlovsk, and that a large number of civilians had died. That was the entire world's knowledge of the event, in print, 9 months after it happened. A paragraph in a small magazine in West Germany. 66 people. 6 weeks, 1 paragraph. Inside the district, of course, the knowledge was total, and it was useless. Everyone in Chkalovsky knew somebody who had died, or who had nearly died. Everyone had watched the chlorine trucks. Everyone had been vaccinated, or had watched their neighbors be vaccinated, against a disease they were being told came from a butcher. The idea that the compound on the northern edge was involved was not a suspicion in that district. It was the obvious reading of the facts, held privately by tens of thousands of people, and it had precisely no weight, because a shared private conviction is not evidence and cannot be produced to anyone. This is the condition that a successful information operation actually creates, not a population that believes the lie. A population that knows the lie is a lie, and understands that knowing changes nothing. It is worth stating what that isolation actually meant in practice. Sverdlovsk was a closed city. Foreign nationals could not enter it. Soviet citizens from elsewhere required a reason to travel there. There was no independent press, no local paper that could investigate a municipal authority, and no mechanism by which a resident with a grievance could put a question to anyone who was obliged to answer. So the containment of the information was not primarily achieved by anything the Extraordinary Commission did in April. It was achieved by the standing architecture of the place, which had been built for other reasons over 30 years, and which happened to be perfectly suited to this. The Commission did not have to build a wall. It only had to decline to open a door in one that already existed. Life in the district resumed. The factories ran. The vaccination rosters went into a filing system somewhere. The graves in the eastern cemetery settled and grassed over, and acquired their markers with names on them and 2 dates each. And the second date on 66 of those markers fell inside the same 6-week window in the spring of 1979. Nobody removed the markers. There was no reason to. A gravestone does not say why. That is the whole principle, and it was invisible to everyone at the time. A record is dangerous when it explains. A record that merely records is furniture. The security service took what explained. It left what recorded. 13 years later, the difference between those two categories was the difference between a rumor and a proof. For the next 6 years, the Soviet position on Sverdlovsk was maintained by simply not being asked about it very much. That changed in 1986, when the government began to explain itself in detail, to foreigners, in person, and discovered that a detailed explanation is far more effective than a denial. The explanation the Soviet government settled on was not vague. That is the single most important thing to understand about it, and it is the thing that almost every retelling of this story gets wrong. The standard picture of a Soviet cover-up is a wall, a refusal, a spokesman saying that no such event occurred and declining to elaborate. Sverdlovsk was not handled that way, and if it had been, it would have collapsed inside 2 years. What the government produced instead was a complete alternative case, in clinical language, with numbers. The case ran as follows. Anthrax is endemic in the livestock of the southern Urals, and has been for as long as anyone has kept records. This is entirely true, and it is the load-bearing beam of the whole structure. The soil of that region holds old animal burial grounds, some of them a century old, where diseased cattle were put into the ground before anyone understood how long a spore survives. Every year, in the ordinary course of things, some Soviet livestock contracted anthrax, and some rural people caught it from them. It was a known agricultural problem with a known annual case count. It is worth spending a moment on how true that background really was, because the strength of a good lie is measured in how much of it is not a lie. The southern Urals genuinely are anthrax country. The organism has been in the soil there for a very long time, and across the Soviet Union there were tens of thousands of registered burial grounds where diseased livestock had been interred, some of them dating to the 19th century, many of them poorly recorded, and some of them simply forgotten. Spores survive in ground like that for decades. Construction work, flooding, or an eroding riverbank can bring them back to the surface, and periodically they did. Human anthrax was, in consequence, a real and recurring Soviet public health problem, with an annual case count, a body of clinical literature, and doctors in rural districts who had seen it. It was not an exotic disease that required explaining. A Soviet physician in 1979, hearing that there had been an anthrax outbreak in a rural oblast, would have thought, without any prompting, of cattle. That is the material the cover story was built from. Not invention, selection. In the spring of 1979, the account went, that ordinary problem became a serious one. Anthrax appeared in the region's animals in late March. Infected cattle were slaughtered, and meat from those carcasses was sold outside the state system through private sale, which was illegal and common. People in the Chkalovsky district bought it and ate it, and contracted the gastrointestinal form of the disease. A smaller number handled the raw carcasses and contracted the skin form, and in some of those the infection went systemic. 96 cases, onsets from the 4th of April to the 18th of May. 64 deaths, all attributed to the intestinal route. No inhalation cases at all. Look at what that account does. It supplies a source, a mechanism, a transmission route, a date, a case count, a mortality figure, and a clinical breakdown by form of disease. It explains the 6-week spread because a contaminated meat supply distributes over weeks. It explains why the victims were adults, because adults buy meat at markets. It explains why they were unrelated, because they were unrelated customers. It even supplies a moral, which is that the tragedy was caused by illegal private trading outside the state distribution system, and if that is not a very Soviet moral, then nothing is. And it invites verification. That is the audacious part. The account is specific enough to be checked, and it was offered to foreign scientists in exactly that spirit. This is the reframe on which the rest of this film turns. The institution in Moscow was not hiding. It was arguing. It had understood something that a simple denial would have missed, which is that a scientific community cannot be silenced, but it can be answered, and that an answer with numbers in it will be treated as a contribution rather than as an obstruction. A wall provokes people to climb it. A hypothesis invites them to test it, and testing it requires access, and access is the thing the state controls. Every element of the response fits together once you see it this way. The confiscation of the hospital records was not a separate act of concealment running alongside the meat explanation. It was the meat explanation's only requirement. The story is unfalsifiable exactly as long as nobody can examine a chest. The moment any competent pathologist anywhere sees the mediastinum of a Sverdlovsk victim, the argument is finished in a sentence, because inhalational anthrax does not look like intestinal anthrax, and no amount of official assertion changes what is visible on a slide. So the two things are one thing. The story and the seizure are a single instrument with two ends. The story is what is shown. The seizure is what makes the story unanswerable, and neither works without the other, which also means the whole apparatus had one point of failure, and it was not in Moscow. It was a room in a hospital in Sverdlovsk, where a woman had put some jars on a shelf. For 13 years, nobody in the Soviet Ministry of Health knew that the point of failure existed. They defended their case in the confidence that the physical evidence had been collected. They were wrong about that, and they were wrong about it the entire time, and there is a particular kind of irony in the fact that the most sophisticated element of the operation, the decision to argue rather than deny, was also the element that made the surviving evidence lethal to it. A denial can absorb a surprise. A specific clinical claim cannot. Once you have said in public that none of these people had inhalation anthrax, 42 autopsy reports showing inhalation anthrax do not merely contradict you, they convict you. There is one more property of the meat account that only becomes visible in hindsight, and it is the cruelest one. It blamed the dead, not in so many words. The official story never accused anyone in Chkalovsky of anything, but the mechanism it described required the victims to have bought meat outside the state system. That is a small illegality, the kind almost everyone committed, and the kind nobody admits to a stranger. Under that account, 66 people died because they had gone looking for a cheaper cut. Their families were left with that. A husband who died in a hospital corridor in 3 days had, according to the state, done it to himself with a purchase. There was no compensation, because there was no fault to compensate. There was no memorial, because there was nothing to memorialize beyond a food safety failure. The graves went into a controlled section of a cemetery, and the markers gave a name and 2 dates and no cause. 13 years later, when investigators knocked on those doors, some of the people who answered had been carrying that version of their own family history for longer than their children had been alive. The argument had to be made to somebody, though, and in 1986 it was. While Sverdlovsk was being washed down, American analysts were reading the rumors, the declassified record of what the United States knew and when is now public, and it runs through the intelligence reporting of 1979 to 1982. Reading it in sequence is an unusual experience. because it is the story of a government arriving at a correct conclusion, writing it down, and being unable to do anything with it. The first item is a Central Intelligence Agency report, dated the 15th of October, 1979, 6 months after the release. It summarizes accounts reaching the West from Soviet émigrés. It reports something between 40 and 60 deaths, which it places in May. It notes that anthrax is a possible cause, and it concludes, correctly and cautiously, that the available evidence is not sufficient to attribute the event to anything. 2 weeks later, on the 29th of October, a Defense Intelligence Agency cable reports similar émigré accounts and notes a military quarantine in the middle of May, while stating that there is nothing conclusive linking the deaths to a biological weapons facility. On the 9th of November, a Defense Intelligence Agency weekly summary goes further in the other direction and emphasizes how little hard information there actually is. So at the end of 1979, 6 months after 66 people died, the assessment of the best resourced intelligence apparatus in the world was a shrug with a footnote. Then it changes. At the turn of the year, a Central Intelligence Agency memorandum makes the shift. The evidence that the accident involved a biological warfare agent, it says, though circumstantial, is compelling. It cites the exclusively military character of the response and the concealment of the disease itself as the key indicators. And it concludes that the release of large quantities of anthrax spores offers the most logical explanation for what was observed. On the 16th of January 1980, another report notes that the allegations have strengthened and records that Defense Minister Ustinov and Health Minister Petrovsky both traveled to Sverdlovsk. On the 28th of January, a further report describes an explosion at a secret laboratory as the cause, and notes that civilian doctors were barred from treating the victims. That January memorandum is the moment the American position hardens, and the reasoning inside it is worth noting because it does not rest on any physical evidence at all. It rests on behavior. The response was exclusively military. The disease itself was being concealed rather than merely the numbers. Both of those are observations about how an institution acted, not about what an organism did, and together they were enough to move a professional assessment from possible to compelling. By the 3rd of March, 1980, a Defense Intelligence Agency trends report pulls the strands together and states the conclusion flatly. The evidence points strongly to an illegal store of biological agents, and probably to biological weapons development or production. Satellite imagery and signals intelligence from the spring of 1979 were re-examined, and analysts found what the briefing material describes as possibly corroborative signs of a serious accident: roadblocks around Compound 19, decontamination trucks, and the visit by the Soviet defense minister. In October of 1981, an Army assessment estimated that tens of kilograms of anthrax would have been required to produce the observed death toll, judged it highly probable that the Soviets retained anthrax for biological warfare purposes, and rated an ongoing agent program at the Sverdlovsk facility as possible. By 1982, the question had moved into the legal and diplomatic arena. A State Department memorandum examines the procedural issues involved in formally charging the Soviet Union with a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention, the treaty Moscow had signed in 1972. The treaty made the stakes explicit. The Soviet Union had signed the Biological Weapons Convention. It was a depositary state. If Sverdlovsk could be proved, what followed was not an embarrassment, but a formal charge that one of the treaty's 3 guarantors had been violating it since the day it entered into force. That is why the American file matters and why it went nowhere. And there the whole thing ran into two obstacles, one of which was the Soviet Union's doing, and one of which was Washington's own. The first obstacle was proof. An intelligence assessment is not evidence in the sense that a treaty dispute requires. It is a reasoned inference from indicators produced by people who cannot show their working without destroying their sources. To bring a charge before an international body, the United States needed material a neutral party could examine, and every piece of such material was inside the Soviet Union, in a locked room, in a city no foreigner could enter. The second obstacle was that the Sverdlovsk charge did not travel alone. It was bundled with a separate set of allegations that Soviet and Allied forces had used toxin weapons in Southeast Asia and in Afghanistan. Those allegations were contested from the beginning, and parts of them were later seriously disputed on scientific grounds. The effect was that the strongest case the United States had, which was Sverdlovsk, was carried into the argument attached to weaker cases, and the whole bundle was discounted at the rate of its weakest component. Moscow, for its part, dismissed the accusations as an attempt to spur the arms race. That was an easier position to hold than it should have been, and the reason it was easier had been supplied by Washington. There is one more thing in the American file worth pausing on, and it is not an error of judgment, but a demonstration of a limit: tens of kilograms. That was the Army's 1981 estimate of how much material must have escaped. The actual figure, established more than a decade later from the physical evidence, was less than 1 gram. The analysts were not incompetent. They were reasoning backwards from a death toll to a quantity, using the dose-response assumptions available at the time, and those assumptions turned out to be wrong by several orders of magnitude. What that gap really measures is the difference between inference and access. Everything the United States had was downstream: rumors, imagery, defector reporting, and arithmetic. It produced the right direction and a wildly wrong magnitude, and no amount of additional analysis could have closed the gap, because closing it required standing in the district with a map and a list of names. The people who could have corrected the estimate were living in Chkalovsky. Nobody had asked them anything. There is a further property of the American file that becomes visible only in hindsight, and it is a lesson about what intelligence is for. Every substantive judgment in that sequence was correct. A biological agent was involved. It was anthrax. It came from the military facility. The response was military. The concealment was deliberate. Analysts reached all of that inside 12 months, working from émigré rumor, overhead imagery, and inference, and they wrote it down in language that was appropriately hedged and turned out to be right, and none of it moved anything. The Soviet Union was not obliged to answer an assessment. It was obliged to answer evidence, and there was none, and so for more than a decade, the United States held a correct conclusion it could not convert into a fact. The conversion, when it finally came, was not performed by an intelligence service. It was performed by a molecular biologist, an anthropologist, a veterinarian, a pathologist, and a public health specialist, with a list of addresses and a set of weather records. Before any of them could do that, though, the Soviet account had to be tested properly. And in 1986, it was tested by exactly the wrong man, in exactly the right way. In 1986, a Harvard professor went to Moscow to ask what had happened in Sverdlovsk. Matthew Meselson was a molecular biologist of very high standing. He had done foundational work on how DNA replicates, and he had spent much of his career on arms control, and he had argued the case inside the American government that led to the United States renouncing biological weapons in 1969. He was not a man Moscow could impress, and he was not a man Washington could direct. He was also, and this turns out to matter enormously, someone with a specific professional history of doubting his own government's accusations against the Soviet Union. Through the early 1980s, the United States had alleged that Soviet and Allied forces were using toxin weapons in Southeast Asia, a claim that came to be known by the name given to the substance, said to be falling from the sky. Messelson examined the evidence and concluded that the samples were something else entirely, of natural origin, and he said so publicly and at length against significant political pressure. The dispute went on for years, and his position was substantially vindicated. So the man who arrived in Moscow in 1986 to ask about Sverdlovsk was a scientist with a demonstrated record of checking American claims rather than accepting them, at professional cost to himself. That is an admirable disposition. It is also, in this particular instance, exactly the disposition the Soviet account was built to exploit. And it is worth saying plainly that this is nobody's fault. A person who has been right about an overclaim once is more careful the second time, not less. Care is what made him useful, and care is what made him available. The account was presented to him by Pyotr Burgasov, a senior figure in the Soviet health apparatus who had held the position of Deputy Minister of Health and who carried real scientific rank. Burgasov did not stonewall. He explained. The outbreak had been caused by contaminated feed reaching cattle, he said, and by meat from those cattle reaching people, and the clinical picture in the victims was consistent with that route. He supplied detail. He answered questions. Messelson found the explanation credible, and for some years he said so. 2 years later, in 1988, the Soviet side escalated the same strategy in the most confident way available to it. Burgasov traveled to the United States with 2 other officials, and they presented the meat account directly to American scientists on American soil. They elaborated on the clinical picture. Most of the victims, they said, had died of the intestinal form. Some had contracted the skin form, which had gone systemic and killed them. None of them, they said, had inhalation anthrax. That is the sentence that ended it, eventually. Not immediately. It took 4 more years, but a specific negative claim, delivered in person to a scientific audience by a named official with a title, is a hostage given to the future, and Burgasov had just handed one over. It is important to be fair to Messelson here, because the easy version of this chapter makes him a dupe, and the easy version is wrong. He did not endorse the meat account out of naivety or sympathy. He examined a specific claim, found it internally consistent, found it consistent with the known epidemiology of anthrax in Soviet livestock regions, and could not find evidence against it, for the excellent reason that the evidence against it had been carried out of 2 hospitals 7 years earlier and was sitting on a shelf that he did not know existed. A scientist who accepts a well-constructed hypothesis in the absence of contradicting data is doing his job correctly. The failure was not in his reasoning, it was in his access. What is more, his provisional acceptance is the reason the case was eventually broken. Because he had publicly credited the Soviet explanation, he was the one person whose reversal would carry decisive weight, and he was the one scientist Moscow had least reason to obstruct when he asked to visit in 1992. The Soviet Ministry of Health spent 6 years persuading the man who would go on to dismantle their account, and they succeeded in persuading him, and that is precisely how he got in the door. The unraveling started with a journalist. In October of 1991, with the Soviet Union in its final months, Peter Gumbel, the Moscow bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, went to Sverdlovsk and did the thing no one had been able to do for 12 years. He talked to people who lived there. What he found was that the official account did not survive contact with the district. He collected the ordinary testimony of ordinary residents, and the ordinary testimony did not describe a meat scare. It described a wave of respiratory deaths in a specific strip of a specific suburb over a specific 6 weeks, a mass vaccination, a chlorine campaign, and a set of families who had been told nothing they believed. It was among these interviews that Tamara Markova repeated what a doctor had said to her about her husband's lungs. Gumbel published, and the account he published was, in his description, riddled with inconsistencies. Notice what the breakthrough actually required. Not a document, not a defector, not an intercept. It required a reporter being physically allowed into the district, and residents being willing to talk to him. Both of those became possible in 1991, for reasons that had nothing to do with anthrax. The Soviet system was coming apart, and the machinery that had kept Sverdlovsk closed for 40 years was failing along with everything else. The story had been sitting in the front rooms of Chkalovsky for 12 years. Nobody had been able to walk in and listen. 7 months later, in May of 1992, the president of Russia settled the matter in a sentence. Boris Yeltsin stated that the security service had shown him the material and that the cause had been the country's own military development. He ordered that the victims' families be compensated. There is a detail about Yeltsin that the story cannot leave out, and it is not a flourish. In April of 1979, Boris Yeltsin was the first secretary of the Sverdlovsk Regional Committee of the Communist Party. He was the most senior party official in that oblast. He was the man in charge of the region in which the release occurred, and he was in the city while it was happening. 13 years later, he was the head of state, and the thing he had presided over as a provincial party boss was a thing he could now end with a sentence. What he had known in 1979, and when, has never been established, and this film is not going to assert it. What can be said is that the admission came from a man who had been there, that it came immediately after the state that required the lie had ceased to exist, and that it was not accompanied by the release of the confiscated records, which have never been produced. Pyotr Burgasov did not retract. He continued to defend the meat account for years afterward, into an era when the head of state had already contradicted it, and he was described in the Russian press as having acted in concert with the security service. He had been a deputy minister of health. He held a doctorate and academic rank. He was, in every formal sense, a qualified man, delivering a qualified opinion, and that is what made him effective. And it is also what makes the record of what he said in the United States in 1988 a permanent part of this story, rather than a footnote to it. The compensation was never actually paid. That order, however, did produce one document. In order to compensate families, the state needed to know which families. And so, in 1992, the security service sat down and compiled a list of the dead. In June of 1992, 5 people flew into Yekaterinburg to find out what had killed 66 of its residents. The city had changed its name back by then. Sverdlovsk had been named for a Bolshevik, and Yekaterinburg had been named for an empress, and the return of the older name was one of thousands of small reversals happening across the country that year. What had not changed was the district, the cemetery, or the apartment blocks in Chkalovsky. The team was small and deliberately assembled. Matthew Messelson led it. Jean Guillemin was a medical anthropologist who would conduct the interviews in Russian. Alexis Shelikov was a public health specialist and a Russian speaker. David Walker was a pathologist. Martin Hugh Jones was a veterinarian, and his presence is the clearest single indicator of how carefully the investigation had been designed, because the official account was about animals, and testing it would require someone who could read a livestock record. Getting there at all had taken a change of country. 2 years earlier, the trip would have been refused, and 5 years earlier, the request would have been unthinkable. The Soviet Union had dissolved in December of 1991. Yeltsin had made his admission in May of 1992, and for a narrow period afterward, a window stood open in which foreign scientists could work in a formerly closed Russian city on a formerly forbidden subject. The investigation happened inside that window. It is not obvious that it could happen now. They had no documents when they arrived. Everything that had been generated at the time by the medical system had been taken in April of 1979 and never returned. What they had was a hypothesis, a district, and permission to be there. On Saturday, the 6th of June, they went to the cemetery. The victims had been buried in a controlled section on the eastern edge of the city, and the graves were still there, and they still had markers on them, and the markers said what markers always say: a name, a date of birth, a date of death. 66 of them carried a date of death inside the 6-week window of the spring of 1979. That is the first hard data set the investigation acquired, and it was acquired by 5 people walking around a graveyard writing things down. There is a version of scientific work that involves instruments, and there is a version that involves a notebook and a pair of shoes, and the reconstruction of the Sverdlovsk outbreak began with the second kind. The second dataset arrived from an unexpected direction. Larissa Mishustina was a deputy of the Supreme Soviet, representing the region, and she gave the team an official list of 64 victims, with their addresses. That list existed because of Yeltsin's compensation order. The security service had assembled it so that the families could be paid, and the families had not been paid, and so the only lasting product of the compensation decree was a roster of the dead with street numbers, which was handed to a group of foreign scientists. The institution that had confiscated the medical record in 1979 had, 13 years later, written the investigators their address book. That is not irony arranged for effect. It is a straightforward property of how bureaucracies handle a secret. A secret is not maintained by an absence of documents. It is maintained by a rule about which documents exist in which office. Change the rule, even for an unrelated reason, even to do something generous that then does not happen, and the documents reappear. With the addresses, the work became field work. Gilliman went through the streets of the Chkalovsky district with Olga Yampolskaya, a Moscow physician who had been an assistant to the head clinician during the outbreak itself, and who now served as interpreter and colleague. They had a list of addresses of people who had died 13 years earlier. They knocked on the doors. A surprisingly large number of them were opened by the victims' spouses and children, still living in the same apartments. That is a fact about Soviet housing, and it is the reason this investigation was possible at all. Housing was allocated, not bought and sold, and people did not move. The widow of a man who died in 1979 was, in a great many cases, still in the flat she had shared with him in 1979. And when 2 women knocked on her door in the summer of 1992 and said they were trying to find out what had really happened, she was there to answer. Gilliman interviewed the relatives of 43 of the dead. She interviewed 9 survivors. Clinical histories were recovered for 5 people who had been hospitalized and lived. The interviews were not asking people what they believed. That was the discipline of it, and it is why the results held up. The questions were factual and small. Where did the person work? What were their hours? Where were they on the 2nd of April? Did they go outside that day? Which route did they walk? When did they first feel unwell? Nobody in Chkalovsky was being asked to accuse anyone of anything. They were being asked for a timetable. That distinction is the methodological core of the whole investigation, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is what separates this from 13 years of rumor. Opinion in the Chkalovsky district was unanimous, and had been since 1979. Everyone believed the compound was responsible. If Gilliman had gone door to door collecting that belief, she would have come home with a very large quantity of agreement and nothing that could be checked, because a district's shared conviction, however correct, is not testable. It cannot be wrong in a way that would show. A timetable can be wrong. A widow who says her husband walked to work along a particular street at a particular hour is making a claim that will either fall inside a plume reconstructed from independent meteorological data or will not. 43 such claims, gathered separately from people who had not compared notes, produce a pattern that either exists or does not. The questions were also, and this matters, answerable. A woman being asked to relive the death of her husband is being asked for something enormous. A woman being asked which shift he worked is being asked for something she knows, in a form she can give. The interviews were designed so that grief was not the instrument of measurement. Working through Yampolskaya made that possible in a further way. She was not a foreign investigator with an interpreter. She was a Russian physician who had been in the wards during the outbreak itself, and who was now sitting in the front rooms of the people whose relatives had been in those wards. The families were talking to someone who had been there, and then, at some point in that process, the team met the two pathologists. Faina Abramova was by then an elderly woman. Lev Grinberg was still working. 13 years earlier, they had completed the documentation of 42 autopsies after being told to hand over the department's holdings, and they had put the tissue in the teaching museum and the paperwork in the wrong filing cabinets, and they had told nobody, and they had waited without any reason to believe that waiting would come to anything. They handed it over. The team returned in August of 1993 for further interviews with relatives and with the survivors. By the end of it, they had assembled, out of a cemetery, a compensation roster, 43 households, 9 living patients, and a set of jars, the epidemic that the record had been taken to conceal. One more thing was recovered in those visits, and it belongs here rather than in the science. The families were told what had happened to their relatives, not by a government, and not in a courtroom, and not with any compensation attached. By a group of scientists sitting in their front rooms, 13 years late. For a great many households in that district, the interview was the first accurate account they had ever received of how the person they lost had died. It arrived with no apology and no acknowledgement from anyone who owed one. It was, nonetheless, the truth, delivered to the people with the most right to it, and it was delivered because somebody had bothered to knock. What remained was to prove where the air had come from. The map the investigators drew in 1992 did not plot where the dead had lived. That decision is the whole reconstruction. Every previous attempt to make sense of the Sverdlovsk outbreak, including the Soviet one, had treated the victims as residents. Residents are what a public health system counts, because a residence is what an administrative record holds. And a map of residences in a district where people live in one block and work in another produces a scatter that means nothing. The team asked a different question. Not where did this person live? Where was this person on Monday the 2nd of April, 1979, during the working day? That is what the interviews had been for. 43 households, 9 survivors, and a list of small factual questions about routes and shifts and errands, assembled into a single point on a map for each person, representing not their home, but their location on one specific afternoon. The result was not a scatter, it was a line. The cases fell into a narrow zone about 4 kilometers long, running from the northern edge of the district down to the southern city limit. 60 of the 66 victims were inside it. The zone was long and thin, the shape of a plume rather than the shape of a neighborhood, and its center line had a compass bearing of 330 degrees, give or take 10. At the northern end of that zone, at the point where the line began, stood the military microbiology facility, Compound 19. 6 of the victims had worked inside the compound itself. 5 more were military reservists, who had all been attending courses at Compound 32, an army base immediately to the south of Compound 19, during the week that began on the 2nd of April. The furthest of the civilian victims lived about 4 kilometers out, along the same line. Then the veterinarians' work began, and the line kept going. Sheep and cattle had died in 6 villages, and every one of those villages sits along the extended axis of the human zone. Rudny, Bolshoi Sidelnikovo, Maloye Sidelnikovo, Pervomaysky, Kashino, and Abramovo, which is about 50 kilometers south-southeast of the compound. The animals had not died in a ring around the city, or on the farms with the poorest hygiene, or wherever infected feed had been delivered. They had died in a straight line pointing back at one building, and now the date that had been waiting since the official account was first written. The Soviet explanation required an animal outbreak beginning in late March, before any human fell ill, so that infected meat could reach the market and be eaten. That sequence is the entire load-bearing structure of the meat account. The earliest livestock losses, for which the investigators could find documentation of an actual diagnosis of anthrax, were in Abramovo on the 5th of April. The 5th of April is after the 2nd of April, when the wind blew. It is after the 4th of April, when the first people in Chkalovsky felt unwell. The animals in the villages did not sicken before the humans and infect them. They sickened after the humans, along the same bearing, at the far end of the same plume. They were not the cause of the outbreak. They were the last casualties of it, standing in fields 50 kilometers downwind. There is a further feature of that line which deserves attention, because it is the part that no alternative explanation has ever accommodated. The zone was not merely elongated, it was narrow, a plume released from a point source, and carried on a steady light wind, spread slowly, and what it draws on the ground is a long, thin figure, with sharp edges, because a person standing a few hundred meters to the side of it received essentially nothing. That is what the Sverdlovsk map shows. 60 of the 66 documented victims are inside a strip 4 kilometers long, and the 6 who are not have explanations of their own in the interview record, involving movements that took them into the strip on the day. Compare that with what a contaminated food supply produces. Meat sold through markets and private sale in a city district disperses along the routes people shop and the networks along which they share food. It produces clusters around households and around vendors. It does not produce a 4-kilometer line with a compass bearing. 2 of the details inside the zone are worth stating on their own, because they are the ones that make the source unambiguous rather than merely probable. 6 of the victims worked inside Compound 19 itself, not near it. Inside the fence, in the place the plume came from, which is the position of maximum exposure, and which is exactly where the highest concentration of cases should fall if the source is what the map says it is. And 5 of the victims were military reservists who had been attending courses at Compound 32, the Army base immediately south of Compound 19, during the week beginning on the 2nd of April. 5 men, unrelated to one another, from different parts of the city, whose only common factor was that a training schedule had placed all of them a few hundred meters downwind of a particular building on a particular week. Reservists on a course do not shop together. They do not share a butcher. They were assembled by an army timetable, and they were killed by a wind direction, and the two facts fit together with nothing left over, which leaves the wind itself, and the wind is where the case stops being an argument and becomes arithmetic. Weather observations from Sverdlovsk airport had been recorded in 1979 in the ordinary way, and copies had gone into an international meteorological data exchange, and from there into an archive in the United States, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. Nothing about that transfer had anything to do with anthrax or with Compound 19. It was routine international weather data sharing, running quietly for decades, indifferent to what it was recording. The Soviet state confiscated the hospital files of the Chkalovsky district. It did not confiscate the weather. On Monday, the 2nd of April, 1979, the airport recorded wind out of the sector between 320 and 350 degrees, continuously, from 4 in the morning until 7 in the evening, at 4 to 6 meters per second. The zone's centerline bearing was 330, plus or minus 10. That is not a near match. That is the same number. And after the 2nd of April, wind from that sector was recorded in fewer than 2% of observations. There was, in effect, one day that spring on which a release from Compound 19 could have produced that exact line of dead people and dead livestock, and the epidemiology and the meteorology, assembled 13 years apart by people who had never met, pointed at the same day. Set beside that, the pathology. 42 documented autopsies from the 2 pathologists in Sverdlovsk, every one showing the hemorrhagic thoracic pattern that comes only from breathing the organism into the deep lung, not the intestinal pattern. Not the pattern that Burgasov had described in person, in the United States, to a room of American scientists, when he said that none of the victims had inhalation anthrax, and the demography, which had been visible from the first month, and which nobody outside the district had been in a position to see. No children, no family groups, adults of working age, unrelated to one another, distributed by where they had stood rather than by what they had eaten. The quantity of material required to do all of this was estimated at less than 1 gram, possibly as little as a few milligrams. That figure deserves one moment of stillness. Less than the weight of a paperclip, released from a building on a Monday morning, killed at least 66 people across 4 kilometers of a city and livestock 50 kilometers beyond it. The American Army had estimated tens of kilograms, reasoning backwards from the bodies, and had been wrong by a factor in the tens of thousands, because they had been reasoning without a map. One thing was not settled, and is still not settled. The investigators concluded, from the victims' accounts of their movements and from the wind record, that the escape happened during the daylight hours of Monday the 2nd of April. Russian sources have indicated the evening or the night of the 2nd going into the 3rd. The difference is a matter of hours, and it does not change the conclusion about the source, but it has never been resolved, and it will not be resolved without the technical record from inside the compound, which has never been published by any government. That is the honest edge of what the evidence reaches. Everything up to it is proved. Past it, the record simply stops, in the place where it was made to stop. The paper appeared in Science on the 18th of November, 1994. Its authors were Messelson, Gielemen, Hugh Jones, Alexander Langmuir, Ilona Popova, Shelikov, and Yampolskaya, which is to say, the American team and their Russian colleagues, under one set of names, 15 years after the event. It laid out the narrow zone, the bearing, the wind record, the livestock along the axis, the pathology, and the sources from which every piece of it had been assembled. The sources section is worth reading as a document in its own right, because it is a description of what a historical record looks like after a confiscation. An administrative list of 68 deceased, prepared by the security service, household interviews with the relatives of 43 of the dead and with 9 survivors, grave markers in a cemetery, pathologist's autopsy notes for 42 cases, assorted hospital lists, clinical histories for 5 hospitalized survivors. Not one of those is a medical record from the outbreak, because there are no medical records from the outbreak. Every one of them is something that existed for another reason and was never collected. The pathologists published too. Abramova and Grinberg had described the anatomical findings from the 42 cases, and that description went into the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, under their own names, as the professional work it had always been. The material that had been shelved among the teaching specimens in 1979 entered the scientific literature as a study of inhalational anthrax pathology, which is what it had been from the day it was made. There is a detail in that authorship worth noticing. The names on the 1994 paper are American and Russian together. The reconstruction of the Sverdlovsk outbreak was not something done to Russia by foreigners. It was done by a joint team, in which Russian physicians who had been present in 1979 appear as co-authors of the document that overturns their own government's account of it. Yampolskaya had been in the wards. Popova was a Russian colleague on the investigation. The paper is, among other things, a record of Russian professionals correcting the Russian state. Then, the tissue itself began to talk. In 1998, a further study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences applied genetic analysis to samples from the victims and found something that had not been expected. The tissue did not carry a single strain of Bacillus anthracis. Different victims carried different strains, more than one, present in the same outbreak. That is not what a natural anthrax event in livestock looks like. It is what a production facility handling multiple strains looks like. And in August of 2016, a team led by Paul Keim at Northern Arizona University, working with the Translational Genomics Research Institute, published a complete genome sequence of the Sverdlovsk organism, recovered from 2 tissue specimens taken at autopsy in 1979. The DNA was badly degraded after 37 years, and they sequenced it anyway. The finding was an anticlimax, and the anticlimax is the point of this chapter. The strain was ordinary. It was consistent with wild-type Bacillus anthracis from Russia. There was no evidence of genetic manipulation. No engineered resistance to antibiotics. No engineered resistance to vaccines. Nothing exotic, nothing designed, nothing that a veterinary microbiologist in 1979 would have found remarkable in a sick cow. Everything that made this organism kill 66 people came from outside the organism. It came from a spray dryer that reduced it to a particle size the human lung will accept and not expel. It came from a production line running an agent for which there was no defensive purpose. And it came from a decision, made within hours, not to tell a district of 10,000 people that they should stay indoors. The bacterium was not the weapon. The bacterium was the ammunition. The weapon was the machinery and the silence, and neither of those things is visible in a genome. There is one more thing the 2016 paper establishes. and it has nothing to do with microbiology. It establishes that in the year 2016, 37 years after they were taken, the tissue specimens that Faina Abramova had carried into a hospital teaching museum were still doing evidentiary work. They had already proved the route of infection in 1993. They had proved the multiplicity of strains in 1998. And in 2016, they answered a question about genetic engineering that nobody in 1979 could have known how to ask, because the technology to ask it would not exist for another 20 years. She did not preserve them for that. She could not have. She preserved them because they were true, and destroying them was not something she was willing to do with her own hands. That is the entire mechanism by which anything survives. There is a further consequence, and it is the one that reaches into the present day. Inhalational anthrax is, thankfully, a very rare disease in human beings. That rarity creates a problem for medicine. To know how much of an agent it takes to make a person ill, how long the illness waits before it appears, and how long after an exposure a person remains at risk, you need a series of human cases with known circumstances, and such series barely exist. Animal work only carries so far. Laboratory accidents produce ones and twos. Sverdlovsk produced 77. In a defined area, on a known day, from a single release, with the wind recorded. It is, in consequence, the foundational human dataset for the disease. When the United States was attacked with anthrax sent through the mail in the autumn of 2001, and 22 people were infected and 5 of them died, the scientific literature that clinicians and planners reached for was substantially built on the Chkalovsky district. The quantitative modeling work that followed says so in its titles. A paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2006 is called, simply, Sverdlovsk Revisited. A further set of dose response and time course models appeared in 2013. Both of them are, in the end, mathematics performed on the movements of Soviet factory workers on a Monday morning in April of 1979. One finding in particular has outlived everything else about this event. The onsets in Sverdlovsk did not cluster tightly. They ran on and on, from the 4th of April to the middle of May, 6 weeks after a single exposure lasting at most a couple of hours. That long tail is the principal human evidence that a person can breathe in this organism and remain well for over a month before the disease appears. And it sits underneath modern guidance on how long antibiotics must be continued after a suspected exposure. The reason a course of prophylaxis is measured in weeks rather than days is, in substantial part, that a woman in a ceramics factory in a Soviet suburb fell ill 40 days after a filter was left out of an exhaust line. Every person who has ever been protected by that guidance was protected by data collected from people who were never told what they had. And the institution itself is still there. The facility at Sverdlovsk did not close. It was reorganized and renamed, as it had been in 1949 and again in 1974, and it exists today as a branch of a Russian military research institute in Yekaterinburg. In August of 2020, the United States Commerce Department placed 3 Russian military biological institutes on its restricted trade list. In March of 2021, further sanctions were imposed on the institute, of which the Yekaterinburg facility is a part. The fence is still there. The city has grown up around it. The narrow strip of ground that the plume crossed in 1979 is now ordinary residential Yekaterinburg, and the people who live along it are, for the most part, not the people who lived along it then. The technical account of what happened in that building on the 2nd of April 1979 has still never been published by anybody. 68 names. The factual question has an answer, and the answer has a ragged edge, and both halves of that have to be said. What killed the people of the Chkalovsky district was an aerosol of anthrax spores. It was released from the military microbiology facility at Compound 19 on Monday the 2nd of April. A light northerly wind carried it south-southeast along a bearing of 330 degrees. It crossed a strip of a working suburb about 4 kilometers long, and it went on into 6 villages beyond the city. The quantity was under a gram. The route of infection was inhalation, documented in 42 autopsies. The official explanation was contaminated meat. It was false, and the men who delivered it in person to American scientists in 1988 knew the pathology reports existed because their own government had ordered them collected. How many people it killed is not knowable and will not become knowable. The investigators documented 66 deaths. The Security Service's own list held 68 names. The Soviet public accounting claimed 96 cases. Nobody has ever produced the confiscated records, and no government has said where they are. Somewhere in the arithmetic between those numbers, there are people who died in that district in those 6 weeks, and who are not counted in any total anyone can now assemble. That is not an open historical question of the kind that further scholarship might close. It is a hole, cut deliberately, by hand, in the 2nd week of April. The other limits should be stated with the same plainness. The exact hour of the release is still disputed. No technical account of what happened inside that building has been published by the Soviet Union or by the Russian Federation. What Boris Yeltsin knew as the region's party chief in 1979, and when he knew it, has never been established, and it is not established here, and the compensation he ordered in 1992 for the families of the dead was not paid. What survived was never meant to survive, and that is the last thing worth saying. Not one piece of the proof was preserved by anybody's design. The grave markers survived because a cemetery is a cemetery. The addresses survived because a compensation scheme needs an address, and because Soviet housing did not let people move. The wind survived because meteorologists in 2 hostile countries had been quietly swapping weather observations for decades, and nobody thought to stop them. And the tissue survived because one pathologist in a regional hospital worked out that the safest place to put something is the place where it already belongs. Take that list and set it against the list of what the state controlled, which was everything that was designed to be a record: the clinical histories, the autopsy protocols, the death certificates, the outbreak reports. Every single item on that side of the ledger is gone. That asymmetry is the finding, and it generalizes further than this one city. The documents an institution creates on purpose are the documents it can find on purpose, and a record that can be found can be collected. What outlasts a determined state is almost never the archive. It is the residue, the gravestone, the housing allocation, the weather log, the teaching collection, the note a man held against a window. Faina Abramova understood that in April of 1979, standing in a corridor with an armful of glass, she did not have a strategy, and she was not building a case. She had worked out, in the time available to her, that the safest place for something is the place where it is not remarkable, and she acted on it. And she then said nothing for 13 years, while the country she lived in told the world a story she could have ended with 1 sentence and a microscope. The cost of that silence was hers alone to carry, and there is no record of anyone thanking her for it at the time. Rima Deyanova kept a note that her husband held against a glass partition on the 10th of May 1979, telling her not to go home. It was not a document. Nobody filed it. It is one of the things that is known about what happened in Sverdlovsk, and it is known for the same reason the jars are known, which is that a person decided to keep it, and then, 13 years later, somebody finally came to the door and asked. If you want the version of this where there is nothing to confiscate because nothing was ever written down, watch the Craven Street investigation next. 28 skeletons in a London basement, an anatomy school, and a register that was never kept at all.